August 20th, 1947, Palace of Justice, Nuremberg. Courtroom 600 is silent as the tribunal prepares to announce sentences in the case that would reshape medicine forever. 23 defendants stand accused, most of them doctors, men with university degrees and hospital appointments. One defendant published fertility research in leading gynecological journals. Another held administrative positions requiring precision and trust. A third coordinated programs affecting millions across occupied Europe. Within hours, 7 of them will be sentenced to hang, not for battlefield decisions, not for carrying weapons into combat, for coordinating and executing medical procedures on prisoners who never consented, never volunteered, and in most cases, never survived. And here's what makes this case different from every other war crimes prosecution at Nuremberg. These defendants had sophisticated legal arguments. They claimed urgent wartime necessity. They cited scientific precedent. They insisted they were following directives from the highest levels of government. The judges heard every argument, examined every piece of evidence, and then one category of experiments conducted at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück concentration camps destroyed every defense they presented. Sterilization experiments. Hundreds of women, mostly Jewish, subjected to chemical injections and radiation procedures designed to permanently destroy their reproductive capacity. This wasn't the experiment with the highest death count at Auschwitz, far from it. It wasn't even the most publicized atrocity. But it was the experiment that forced the tribunal to confront a question that would define modern medical ethics. Can research ever justify treating human beings as laboratory specimens? Can military goals, no matter how urgent, override the fundamental requirement of consent? The answer the judges delivered was absolute and irreversible, and it changed medicine permanently. Today, I'm going to walk you through exactly what happened inside Block 10 at Auschwitz, how sterilization experiments were designed, authorized from Berlin, and documented with bureaucratic precision. How years later, that documentation became evidence in a courtroom where careers ended and gallows were built. Because this isn't just about one program of experiments. This is about the moment international law established a principle that had never existed before in any legal code. The principle that voluntary consent is not optional, not situational, not subject to military override. Absolutely essential. The Nuremberg Code, institutional review boards, every informed consent form you sign before a medical procedure, all of it exists because prosecutors opened files marked sterilization experiments, Auschwitz, 1943, 1944, and showed judges what medicine becomes when consent disappears. So the question isn't whether crimes occurred. The evidence made that undeniable. The question is, what made these specific experiments so legally and morally devastating that they convinced judges execution was the only proportionate sentence? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand why men who coordinated research programs became names on death warrants. But first, you need to see what Allied investigators found when they walked into Auschwitz in January 1945 and discovered something that didn't fit the chaos of a hastily abandoned camp. They found order. January 27, 1945. Soviet forces liberate Auschwitz. The scenes are apocalyptic. Skeletal prisoners barely able to stand. Evidence of industrial-scale killing. Crematoria still smoldering. Gas chambers with scratches on the walls from victims' final moments. The Soviets immediately begin documenting everything, knowing the world needs to see what happened here. But as medical officers move through the camp, they find something that stands apart from the chaotic brutality. They find Block 10 in the main camp, a building that had been used as a medical experimentation facility, and inside they find survivors. Women, hundreds of them, weak and traumatized but alive. These women tell stories that make experienced military doctors pause, because what happened in Block 10 wasn't frenzied violence. It was systematic. It was planned. It was medicine. The women described being selected from transports, being told they were going to work details, being brought to Block 10 and subjected to procedures they didn't understand, injections that caused excruciating pain, radiation treatments that burned their internal organs, medical examinations conducted without explanation, without consent, without anesthesia. And when investigators search the building, they find remnants of a functioning medical facility, equipment for gynecological procedures, X-ray machines, and critically, paperwork. Not complete files. The SS had tried to destroy those before fleeing, but fragments remained. Correspondence, requisition forms, approval documents. Enough to establish a chain of command, enough to show that what happened here wasn't the work of rogue camp guards. This was authorized research, coordinated from Berlin, carried out by licensed physicians. Let me explain why that distinction matters and why it made these experiments more dangerous than random atrocity. The sterilization program had an official justification, a rationale that seemed logical within the twisted framework of Nazi ideology. The Reich was engaged in total war. Resources were stretched. Occupied territories contained millions of people. The Nazis classified as racially undesirable but economically useful for labor. The question posed by SS leadership was clinical and chilling. How do you exploit the labor of these populations while ensuring they can't reproduce? Mass execution was one option, but that required resources, bullets, personnel, and disposal. Sterilization offered what they saw as an elegant alternative. Let them work, prevent them from having children, and the population problem solves itself in one generation. Logical if you accept the premise that some humans are less than human. Monstrous if you recognize that premise as exactly what it was: genocide dressed up as administrative efficiency. So the question went out through official channels. Can mass sterilization be accomplished quickly and cheaply? Can you develop methods that don't require surgical facilities? Can you process thousands of people per day with minimal medical staff? And physicians across the Reich submitted proposals. Two doctors emerged as the primary experimenters at Auschwitz: Dr. Karl Klauberg, a gynecologist with an established reputation in fertility research, and Professor Horst Schumann, who had experience with the T4 euthanasia program. Both submitted proposals. Both received approval. Both arrived at Auschwitz with equipment, assistance, and authorization to use prisoners as test subjects. Klauberg's method was chemical. He developed an injection designed to be administered directly into the uterus, causing inflammation and scarring that would block the fallopian tubes. His goal was to perfect a procedure that could be performed in minutes by nurses with minimal training. No anesthesia required, no surgical facilities necessary. Just an examination table, a syringe, and a solution he'd been refining through trial and error. Schumann's approach was different. He used X-ray radiation, massive doses targeted at the reproductive organs. His equipment was set up in Block 30 initially, then moved. The procedure was brutally simple. Prisoners were positioned between X-ray machines, radiation was administered, and within minutes, their ovaries or testes were burned beyond function. Both methods had the same problem. They required testing, refinement, dosage calibration, and that testing required subjects who couldn't refuse. That's where Block 10 came in. The building became a holding facility for women selected from incoming transports. Jewish women primarily, though political prisoners and Roma women were also used. The selection process was arbitrary and terrifying. Women would arrive at Auschwitz, survive the initial selection at the ramp, be sent to the camp rather than the gas chambers, and then days or weeks later, be pulled from their barracks and told they were being transferred to special medical care. And Block 10 had barred windows, guards at the entrance, and inside, medical staff in white coats conducting procedures that left women screaming, bleeding, and begging to understand what was being done to them. Here's how Klauberg's procedure worked. Women were brought to an examination room. They were strapped to a gynecological table. Without explanation, without anesthesia, Klauberg or his assistants would inject a caustic chemical solution directly into the uterus through the cervix. The pain was described by survivors as unbearable, burning that lasted for hours. Many women developed severe infections. Some died. Others suffered permanent damage to internal organs, not just reproductive, but intestinal and bladder damage from the caustic solution spreading. Klauberg kept meticulous records. He documented the chemical formula, the injection volume, the time required per procedure, the observed effects. He photographed results. He performed follow-up X-rays to verify that fallopian tubes had been successfully blocked. And he wrote reports to Berlin detailing his progress, his success rates, his projections for how quickly the method could be scaled up. Schumann's radiation experiments were faster but less precise. Women would be brought to the X-ray room, positioned with their pelvic region between two machines, and exposed to radiation doses far beyond any medical standard. The immediate effects were severe burns, internal and external. The long-term effects were ovarian destruction, hormonal disruption, and in many cases, cancers that developed years later. Men were also subjected to Schumann's experiments. The procedure was similar, radiation targeted at the testicles, followed by surgical removal to study the tissue damage. The goal was to determine the minimum radiation dose necessary to guarantee sterilization. Schumann treated it as a calibration problem, a technical question to be solved through repeated testing. The subjects were human beings, but in his reports they were listed as cases, numbered and categorized by age, health status, and radiation dose received. Now, here's what makes this particularly significant for the later trial. Both Klauberg and Schumann operated with full authorization from the highest levels of SS medical hierarchy. Their experiments were reviewed. Their funding came through official channels. Their requests for equipment and personnel were approved by administrators who knew exactly what the research entailed. This wasn't hidden. This wasn't a secret program concealed from leadership. Heinrich Himmler personally corresponded with Klauberg, expressing interest in the research, asking for progress updates, discussing timelines for large-scale implementation. Victor Brack, chief administrative officer in the Chancellery of the Führer, coordinated the sterilization program's bureaucratic framework, ensuring that resources were allocated, that facilities were prepared, that the legal groundwork was laid for eventual mass deployment. And here's the detail that becomes crucial in 1947. All of this was documented. Every approval, every requisition, every report. The Nazi bureaucracy's obsessive record-keeping created a paper trail that survived the war. When Allied investigators began gathering evidence for war crimes trials, they found filing cabinets full of correspondence about sterilization experiments. Letters from Klauberg to Himmler describing successful procedures and requesting more subjects. Memos from Brack's office discussing the logistics of expanding the program. Budget documents showing funding allocations for equipment and personnel. The defendants built their own prosecution case, page by page, memo by memo, thinking they were documenting important wartime research. Before we go further, if you're finding this deep dive into the doctor's trial valuable and you want to see more historical analysis using primary sources and trial testimony, hit that subscribe button. It genuinely helps the channel and tells me this type of content is worth creating. And as we continue, I want you to think about a question. Where's the line between research and atrocity? Is it consent? Is it intent? Is it outcome? Drop your thoughts in the comments because this question didn't end in 1947. Let me show you how investigators pieced this together. By late 1945, while Allied forces had captured thousands of Nazi documents, offices in Berlin had been seized, ministry buildings searched, SS headquarters raided, and buried in that massive archive of paperwork, prosecutors found references to medical experiments at concentration camps. Not vague references, specific descriptions, budget line items, personnel assignments. The evidence pointed to a coordinated program of human experimentation that crossed every ethical boundary imaginable. But evidence alone wasn't enough. The prosecutors needed a legal framework. How do you charge doctors with crimes when they were acting under state authority? How do you prove that following orders doesn't excuse systematic torture? How do you establish that medical research can be prosecuted as murder? The answer required building a case that showed premeditation, coordination, and most critically, the absence of any legitimate medical justification that could excuse the suffering inflicted. Brigadier General Telford Taylor, chief prosecutor for the Nuremberg medical trial, made a strategic decision. The indictment would focus on specific categories of experiments. Freezing experiments at Dachau, high-altitude experiments, malaria experiments, and sterilization experiments conducted primarily at Auschwitz and Ravensbrück. Each category demonstrated clear violations of medical ethics, but sterilization experiments had a unique quality. They showed that this wasn't about battlefield necessity or emergency medicine under impossible conditions. This was about using human beings as raw material for research designed to facilitate genocide. The indictment named 23 defendants: Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and the highest-ranking medical official in the Reich; Victor Brack, administrative coordinator of sterilization programs; and multiple other doctors, administrators, and SS officers who authorized, conducted, or facilitated the experiments. Notably, Karl Klauberg and Horst Schumann, the two primary experimenters at Auschwitz, were not in the dock. Klauberg had fled and was eventually captured by the Soviets. Schumann escaped to Africa. But their work, their reports, their documented crimes became central evidence against the defendants who authorized and coordinated their research. December 9th, 1946. The trial begins. The courtroom is set up with precision. Judges from the American Military Tribunal presiding, prosecution tables stacked with evidence folders, defense attorneys prepared with thick briefing books, and the defendants sitting in two rows, some looking defiant, others visibly nervous, all of them about to hear evidence that would seal their fates. The prosecution's opening statement is methodical and devastating. They lay out a framework. These defendants participated in medical experiments that violated the most basic principles of medical ethics and human dignity. The experiments were conducted without consent. They caused death, torture, and permanent injury. They were planned, coordinated, and documented by men who knew exactly what they were doing. Then the prosecution begins presenting evidence, and they start with documents. Report after report describing sterilization experiments. Correspondence between Himmler and Klauberg discussing progress and timelines. Memos from Brack's office allocating resources and coordinating logistics. Budget documents showing expenditures for X-ray equipment and chemical supplies. Each document is entered into evidence, cataloged, projected on screens for the judges to examine. And what emerges is a picture of systematic research conducted with bureaucratic efficiency. One letter, dated June 1942 from Himmler to Klauberg, expresses enthusiasm about the sterilization research and asks when the method will be ready for mass deployment. Himmler writes about projecting how many people could be sterilized per day with minimal medical staff. He's not discussing medicine, he's discussing industrial-scale reproductive destruction, planned with the same efficiency applied to railway schedules and weapons production. Another document, a report from Klauberg to Himmler, dated 1943, describes successful sterilization procedures on multiple subjects and projects that, with proper resources, one doctor with 10 assistants could sterilize hundreds of women per day. Klauberg includes technical details, chemical formulations, procedure times, success rates measured by X-ray confirmation of blocked fallopian tubes. The report reads like a business proposal, clinical and optimistic, with no acknowledgement that the subjects were human beings experiencing agony. The judges lean forward, reading carefully, because these aren't second-hand accounts. These aren't witness memories that might be questioned. These are the defendant's own words, their own reports, preserved in official files. And then the prosecution presents testimony from doctors who examined survivors after liberation, medical experts who documented the physical damage caused by sterilization experiments. A Soviet military physician testifies about examining women from Block 10 at Auschwitz. He describes finding severe internal scarring, infections, damaged reproductive organs, and evidence of procedures performed without surgical protocols or sterile conditions. He testifies that many women suffered complications that would cause chronic pain for the rest of their lives, that some developed cancers directly linked to radiation exposure, that the procedures had no therapeutic purpose whatsoever. An American military doctor testifies about the radiation doses used in Schumann's experiments. He explains that the doses were 10 to 20 times higher than any legitimate medical procedure would use, that exposure at those levels guaranteed severe tissue damage, that there was no medical scenario where such doses would be appropriate. He tells the court that, from a scientific perspective, the experiments were poorly designed, using inconsistent protocols that made the data nearly worthless for any research purpose. So the experiments weren't just unethical. They were bad science that caused immense suffering and produced unreliable results. But here's what the prosecution needs to prove beyond the documents and medical testimony. They need to show the human cost. They need judges who've been reading clinical reports and legal briefs to understand what these experiments meant to the people who survived them. And that means bringing survivors into the courtroom. January 1947. The prosecution calls witnesses who survived Block 10. This is delicate. The tribunal has rules about testimony. Witnesses must be able to provide specific, verifiable information. They must be cross-examined. Their testimony must relate directly to charges against specific defendants. The prosecution can't simply parade survivors through the courtroom to generate sympathy. They need witnesses who can testify to facts, to procedures, to timelines that connect to the documentary evidence. An Auschwitz survivor takes the stand. She's a Polish Jewish woman who was selected for Block 10 in 1943. She's asked to describe what happened, and her testimony is measured, careful, devastatingly precise. She describes being taken from her barracks without explanation, being brought to Block 10 and told she would receive medical treatment, being brought to an examination room where Dr. Klauberg was waiting. She describes the procedure, the pain, the lack of explanation or consent. She describes being returned to Block 10 and spending days in agony, unable to stand, developing a fever that nearly killed her. Defense attorneys object. They argue that the witness can't definitively prove which doctor performed the procedure, that memories from traumatic events are unreliable, that her testimony is prejudicial without corroborating evidence. The prosecution responds by presenting hospital records from after the war, documenting the witness's injuries, medical examinations showing damage consistent with the procedures she described. And then they present something else. A roster found in Block 10 listing prisoners by number, procedure date, and initials indicating which doctor conducted the procedure. The witness's prisoner number appears on that list, dated exactly when she testified, with initials matching Klauberg's staff. The defense attorneys sit down. The testimony continues. Another survivor describes Schumann's radiation experiments, being brought to a room with X-ray machines, being positioned and told to stand still, feeling intense heat during the exposure, developing burns within hours and collapsing from pain within days. She describes watching other women go through the same process. Some never returned from the hospital. Others came back permanently damaged, unable to walk properly, suffering from infections that never fully healed. The courtroom is silent, because what these women are describing isn't wartime medicine making difficult choices under pressure. This is systematic torture, dressed up with medical equipment and clinical documentation. And then comes the moment that shifts everything. The moment when the defense's arguments, all their legal sophistication and precedent citing and military necessity claims, collapse completely. The prosecution calls a survivor witness who can testify not just about her own experience, but about what she observed as a prisoner forced to assist in Block 10. This witness was a nurse before the war. She has medical training. She understands procedures and protocols. And she was forced to assist Klauberg during procedures, to hold instruments, to clean equipment, to help restrain women who were struggling. Her testimony is clinical and absolutely devastating. She describes watching Klauberg work. She describes his demeanor, focused and efficient, treating the procedures as routine medical tasks. She describes women begging for explanations, begging to know what was being done to them, and Klauberg ignoring them completely. She describes equipment that wasn't properly sterilized, procedures performed back-to-back without cleaning examination tables, Women left bleeding and screaming while Klauberg moved to the next subject. And then she testifies about something that makes the judges visibly react. She describes Klauberg keeping personal notes, separate from official reports. Notes where he recorded observations about which subjects responded better to procedures, which caused interesting complications, which died, and what he learned from their deaths. The prosecution asks if she saw these notes. She confirms she did. The prosecution asks what happened to them. She testifies that Klauberg burned many documents before fleeing Auschwitz, but some pages survived. The prosecution presents fragments of Klauberg's personal notes recovered from Block 10, handwritten observations describing procedures in detached clinical language. One note describes a woman who developed a severe infection after injection, calling it an unexpected variable that required further study. Another note discusses a subject who died during a follow-up procedure, noting that future iterations should account for weakened tissue response. These aren't the words of a doctor treating patients. These are the words of a researcher studying specimens, and that distinction destroys the defense's primary argument. Because throughout the trial, defense attorneys have been arguing that these experiments, while regrettable, served legitimate military purposes, that wartime conditions required difficult choices, that the research, uncomfortable as it was, aimed to solve real problems facing the Reich. But Klauberg's notes reveal something else entirely. They reveal a researcher pursuing academic questions, testing variables, refining techniques, not because lives depended on immediate answers, but because he was building a methodology for mass implementation. He was developing a system for industrial-scale sterilization. The prosecution hammers this point. They ask the survivor witness directly, did any woman in Block 10 volunteer for these procedures? No. Did any woman give informed consent? No. Did any woman have the option to refuse? No. Were women told what was being done to them or why? No. The answers are unambiguous, and they destroy the military necessity defense because even in wartime, even under extreme circumstances, medicine requires consent. Soldiers who volunteer for dangerous duty know the risks. Prisoners strapped to examination tables don't get that choice. The defense tries a different approach. They argue that the defendants on trial, the administrators and coordinators, weren't directly involved in conducting experiments. Victor Brack, for example, never performed a sterilization procedure himself. He coordinated logistics, processed paperwork, allocated resources. Can you hold an administrator criminally responsible for actions carried out by others? The prosecution's answer is yes, absolutely, when that administrator knew exactly what the resources were being used for and actively facilitated it. They present Brack's correspondence, letters discussing sterilization program timelines, memos about securing facilities and equipment, reports reviewing progress and pushing for faster implementation. Brack wasn't a passive bureaucrat processing forms without understanding their meaning. He was an active participant in planning and coordinating experiments he knew would cause suffering and death, and the paper trail proves it beyond any doubt. The defense tries to argue following orders. Several defendants claim they were implementing directives from Himmler, from Hitler himself, that refusing would have meant their own arrest or execution, that they had no choice. This argument has worked in some contexts. Low-level personnel following direct orders under threat sometimes receive reduced sentences. But for senior officials, for doctors with professional autonomy, for administrators who volunteered for positions knowing what they entailed, this defense fails completely. The prosecution presents evidence showing that these weren't men drafted into unpleasant duties against their will. These were careerists who saw opportunities and seized them. Klauberg wrote to Himmler requesting permission to conduct research. Brack actively sought roles in program coordination. These men positioned themselves to participate, then documented their work with pride, expecting recognition and advancement. And here's the legal principle the tribunal establishes, a principle that goes beyond this specific trial. When you're a medical professional, you have obligations that supersede military rank or state authority. The Hippocratic tradition, the fundamental duty to do no harm, creates responsibilities that can't be overridden by orders. A doctor who participates in torture doesn't stop being guilty because someone told him to do it. The medical license, the professional training, the ethical framework of medicine all create a standard that defendants are expected to uphold regardless of political pressure. This is revolutionary. Before Nuremberg, international law didn't clearly establish this principle. The trial is creating new legal ground, arguing that certain human rights are so fundamental that violating them is criminal regardless of domestic law or military orders. And the sterilization experiments provide perfect evidence for this argument because they show doctors making deliberate choices, documenting their methods, and showing no sign of moral conflict. By spring 1947, both sides have presented their cases. Weeks of testimony, hundreds of documents, dozens of witnesses. The tribunal adjourns to deliberate. The judges face an extraordinary task. They're not just deciding individual guilt, they're establishing precedent that will govern medical research and human rights law for generations. They're drawing a line that medicine can never cross again. The deliberations take weeks. The judges review evidence meticulously. They consult legal experts and medical ethicists. They draft detailed written opinions explaining their reasoning, knowing this verdict will be studied and debated for decades. And as they work through the evidence, certain facts become undeniable. The experiments were conducted without consent. The researchers knew subjects were suffering and dying. The documentation proves premeditation and coordination, and no military necessity, no state authority, no following orders defense can excuse systematic torture dressed up as medical research. August 20th, 1947. The tribunal reconvenes. The courtroom is packed with journalists, military observers, legal scholars, and survivors hoping to see justice delivered. The defendants sit in 2 rows, faces tense, knowing some of them will be sentenced to death. Judge Walter Beals, presiding, begins reading the judgment. It's long, detailed, methodical. The tribunal addresses each category of experiments, each defendant's specific role, each legal argument raised by the defense. When the judgment reaches sterilization experiments, the language becomes sharp and unambiguous. The judges don't just find the experiments criminal, they explain why these acts represent something beyond ordinary war crimes. The judgment states that the sterilization experiments were part of a genocidal program designed to eliminate populations through reproductive destruction, that the experiments served no legitimate medical purpose that could justify the suffering inflicted, that consent was not merely absent but impossible, given that subjects were prisoners with no power to refuse. The tribunal emphasizes a critical point. The researchers weren't trying to develop therapeutic treatments. They were building tools for genocide, refining methods to efficiently sterilize millions of people. And that intent, combined with the systematic torture required to perfect those methods, makes the crimes particularly heinous. The judgment addresses Brack specifically. It notes his central role in coordinating sterilization programs, his correspondence showing full knowledge of what experiments entailed, his active efforts to expand the program. The judges conclude that administrative participation doesn't diminish guilt. Brack's coordination made him complicit in every procedure conducted, every woman tortured, every person permanently damaged. Then the judgment makes a broader statement, a statement that transcends this specific trial. The tribunal declares that certain principles of medical ethics are universal and absolute, that consent is not optional, not situational, not subject to military override. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Those words would become the foundation of the Nuremberg Code, 10 principles governing medical research that begin with that absolute requirement. The judges explain their reasoning carefully. They cite the sterilization experiments as evidence of what happens when consent disappears, when prisoners become specimens, when reproductive capacity becomes a target for elimination through medical procedures. The tribunal states that allowing such research under any circumstances would mean the end of medicine as a healing profession. It would transform doctors into instruments of state violence. And that brings us to the sentencing phase, the moment when legal judgment becomes moral reckoning. The tribunal announces its verdicts defendant by defendant. Some receive prison terms, others are acquitted on certain charges while convicted on others, and then the judges announce the death sentences. 7 defendants will hang. Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal physician and the highest-ranking medical official on trial. Victor Brack, coordinator of sterilization programs and administrative architect of medical genocide. Rudolf Brandt, Himmler's chief administrative officer, who processed prisoner transfers for experiments. Joachim Mrugowski, chief of hygiene for the SS, who oversaw multiple camp experiments. Wolfram Sievers, Reich business manager of the Ahnenerbe Research Organization. Waldemar Hoven, chief doctor at Buchenwald. Karl Gebhardt, president of the German Red Cross and senior SS physician. Of these 7, Victor Brack's connection to sterilization experiments is explicit and documented. His sentence specifically cites his role in coordinating the program, facilitating research, and pushing for large-scale implementation. The judges note that Brack wasn't a doctor, but his administrative authority made him essential to the entire apparatus. Without his coordination, the experiments couldn't have been conducted at the scale they reached. The death sentences shock some observers. There are calls for clemency, arguments that life imprisonment would be more appropriate, suggestions that execution is too extreme for men who didn't personally kill with their own hands. But the tribunal's reasoning is clear and deliberate. These men didn't just violate medical ethics, they systematically corrupted an entire profession. They made doctor a word prisoners feared. They turned hospitals into laboratories of torture, and most damningly, they documented their crimes with pride, intending to publish, to advance careers, to gain recognition for research built on suffering. The judgment specifically cites sterilization experiments in explaining why execution is necessary. The tribunal notes that these experiments demonstrate complete moral bankruptcy. that researchers watched hundreds of people suffer, documented every detail, and never once reconsidered. That senior officials reviewed progress reports and saw opportunities for expansion, not crimes requiring intervention. The judges conclude that some crimes are so fundamental, so destructive of basic human dignity, that the only proportionate response is execution. That allowing these men to live would suggest their crimes were somehow less than murder. June 2nd, 1948, Landsberg Prison, Bavaria. The executions are carried out. 7 men who once held positions of authority and respect climbed 13 steps to a gallows. The hangings are swift and efficient, conducted with the same clinical precision these men once applied to their research subjects. Victor Brack's last words are reportedly defiant. He claims he was serving Germany's interests, that history would understand the necessity of difficult wartime decisions. History has not been kind to that argument. The executions mark a turning point, not just in international law, but in humanity's understanding of what medicine means. The trial established principles that now govern every aspect of human subject research worldwide. The Nuremberg Code, 10 principles drafted based on the trial's findings, becomes the foundation for all modern medical ethics frameworks. And the first principle is absolute and non-negotiable. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. Let me show you why this matters today, why experiments conducted in the 1940s and prosecuted in 1947 still shape every interaction you have with medical research. When you participate in a clinical trial, you sign a consent form explaining risks, benefits, and your right to withdraw. That form exists because of Block 10 at Auschwitz. When researchers must get approval from institutional review boards before conducting experiments, that requirement exists because prosecutors showed judges what happens when research operates without oversight. When medical schools teach ethics courses emphasizing patient autonomy and informed consent, those courses trace their origin directly to the Nuremberg medical trial. The principle is fundamental and simple. Your body belongs to you. No researcher, no matter how qualified, no matter how important the research, no matter how many lives might theoretically be saved, can use your body without your informed, voluntary consent. That principle seems obvious now. In 1947, it wasn't codified in international law. It became law because judges in Nuremberg confronted evidence from Auschwitz and drew a line that medicine can never cross. But here's what makes the legacy complicated and morally challenging. The trial addressed specific defendants and specific experiments. It established ethical principles. It executed 7 men. But it didn't end medical research that pushes ethical boundaries. It didn't eliminate the tension between research goals and patient rights. It didn't solve the question of how to balance potential benefits against individual autonomy. Even today, medical research faces ethical dilemmas. How much information must be disclosed for consent to be truly informed? Can vulnerable populations ever truly volunteer freely? What oversight is sufficient to prevent abuse? These questions didn't end at Nuremberg. They became permanent features of medical ethics, requiring constant vigilance and constant debate. The sterilization experiments at Auschwitz represent an extreme, an absolute violation that no reasonable person would defend. But the ethical framework established to prevent such atrocities also governs less clear-cut situations. Research in developing countries, experiments on prisoners, studies involving children or people with cognitive impairments, emergency research where consent can't be obtained. Every situation requires applying principles, first articulated in 1947, asking whether consent is truly voluntary, truly informed, truly meaningful. And here's why the doctor's trial remains relevant beyond historical interest. Because the core question it addressed hasn't disappeared. What are the limits of research? Where's the line between pursuing knowledge and exploiting human subjects? Who decides when that line has been crossed? The trial provided answers. But applying those answers to new situations requires ongoing ethical reasoning. The Nuremberg Code states that experiments should be designed to avoid unnecessary physical and mental suffering. That experiments should be conducted only by scientifically qualified persons. That subjects should be free to end participation at any time. These principles sound straightforward, but implementing them in practice requires judgment, oversight, and institutional commitment to prioritizing human dignity over research goals. The legacy of the doctor's trial extends beyond courtrooms and ethics textbooks. It shapes institutional structures that govern research today. Every major research institution has an institutional review board, a committee that reviews proposed experiments before they're approved. These boards exist because Nuremberg established that research can't be self-regulating, that researchers pursuing knowledge need external oversight to ensure they don't cross ethical lines. IRBs evaluate consent procedures, risk-benefit ratios, and protections for vulnerable populations. They have authority to reject research proposals, require modifications, or shut down ongoing studies if ethical violations occur. This entire system traces back to the recognition, forced by evidence from Auschwitz, that medicine without accountability becomes torture. The Declaration of Helsinki, adopted by the World Medical Association in 1964, expanded on Nuremberg Code principles. It emphasized that the interests of individual subjects must always take precedence over the interests of science and society. That principle directly responds to the justifications offered by Nazi doctors, who argued that harming individuals was acceptable if it served broader goals. Helsinki rejected that logic absolutely. Individual rights trumped collective benefits. The Belmont Report, issued in 1979 by the U.S. National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects, established 3 core principles for ethical research: respect for persons, requiring informed consent and protecting vulnerable populations; beneficence, requiring that risks be minimized and benefits maximized; justice, requiring that research burdens and benefits be distributed fairly. Each principle responds to specific violations documented at the doctor's trial, but implementing these principles reveals ongoing challenges. Consider research in emergency situations. A patient arrives unconscious at a hospital. Researchers are testing a new trauma treatment. Can they enroll the patient without consent? Traditional ethics says no, but that makes certain life-saving research impossible. Modern regulations allow exception from informed consent in narrow circumstances, with strict safeguards and community consultation. But every exception raises questions about where the line is. Consider research in developing countries. A pharmaceutical company wants to test a new drug where the disease is prevalent. They offer participants treatment and compensation that seem generous by local standards. Is consent voluntary when participants are impoverished and desperate for medical care? When the alternative to participation is no health care at all? The ethical framework says consent must be voluntary, but defining voluntary in contexts of extreme inequality remains deeply contested. Consider research involving prisoners. The Nuremberg Code explicitly warned against using prisoners as research subjects, given the coercion inherent in confinement. Yet some argue that prisoners should have the right to participate in research, that denying them access is paternalistic. Modern regulations allow prisoner research with enhanced protections, but the tension between protecting vulnerable populations and respecting autonomy continues. These aren't theoretical questions. They're practical challenges facing research ethics committees, institutional review boards, and researchers every day. The principles established at Nuremberg provide a framework, but applying that framework requires constant ethical reasoning and institutional vigilance. And here's what makes the sterilization experiments at Auschwitz particularly instructive for modern ethics. They demonstrate how easily medicine can be corrupted when ideological goals override professional obligations. The doctors involved weren't sadistic monsters. They were careerists pursuing professional advancement, researchers interested in solving technical problems, administrators implementing policy directives. They convinced themselves that what they were doing was justified by larger goals. They normalized atrocity through bureaucratic processes and scientific language. That's the warning that remains relevant. Medical professionals today operate in systems with institutional pressures, funding incentives, career advancement structures, and policy directives that can create ethical conflicts. The safeguards established after Nuremberg, informed consent, external oversight, and ethical review, exist because professional training alone doesn't guarantee ethical behavior. Systems must be designed to make unethical research difficult, to create barriers between research ambition and human exploitation. The survivors of Block 10 carried physical and psychological scars for the rest of their lives. Many could never have children due to the procedures inflicted on them. Many developed chronic health conditions directly resulting from infections, scarring, and radiation damage. Many struggled with trauma that never fully healed. Their suffering wasn't theoretical. It wasn't an acceptable cost for advancing knowledge. It was torture inflicted by people who should have protected them. And when those survivors testified at Nuremberg, when they described their experiences in clinical detail, when they faced cross-examination from defense attorneys trying to undermine their credibility, they were doing more than seeking individual justice. They were establishing a historical record. They were forcing the world to confront what medicine becomes when consent disappears. The death sentences handed down on August 20th, 1947, weren't just punishment for individual defendants. They were a statement about accountability, a declaration that some professions carry special obligations, that medical training creates responsibilities that can't be overridden by state authority or military necessity, that doctors who betray their profession's fundamental principles will face the ultimate penalty. Some scholars argue the executions were too extreme, that international law shouldn't include capital punishment, that life imprisonment would have been more appropriate. Others argue that anything less than execution would have minimized the crimes, would have suggested that medical torture was somehow less serious than other forms of murder. The debate continues, but the historical fact remains. 7 men were hanged for their roles in medical experiments, and that execution sent a message that shaped medical ethics permanently. Victor Brack's coordination of sterilization programs made him directly culpable for hundreds of victims at Auschwitz alone, and potentially thousands more if the program had been fully implemented as planned. His administrative efficiency, his careful documentation, his coordination across multiple agencies, all of it created infrastructure for genocide disguised as medical research. And when judges sentenced him to death, they established that administrative participation doesn't reduce guilt, that enabling atrocity is equivalent to committing it. The legacy of Block 10 extends to reproductive rights and bodily autonomy debates that continue today. The Nazi sterilization program, both the mass sterilizations under the 1933 law for the prevention of offspring with hereditary diseases and the experimental methods tested at Auschwitz, represents an extreme violation of reproductive autonomy. It demonstrates what happens when the state claims authority over individuals' reproductive capacity, when eugenics ideology overrides individual rights, when some people are designated as unworthy of reproduction. Modern debates about reproductive freedom, about access to contraception and abortion, about forced sterilization of marginalized populations, all occur in the shadow of that history. The principle that individuals have fundamental rights over their own bodies, that the state cannot force reproductive choices, traces back in part to the international community's horror at what happened at Auschwitz. So when we look back at the doctor's trial, when we examine the evidence presented about sterilization experiments, when we read the tribunal's judgment and the death sentences it imposed, we're not just studying history. We're examining the foundation of principles that govern medicine, research, and human rights today. The question posed at the beginning remains: what made sterilization experiments so legally and morally devastating that they convinced judges execution was necessary? The answer is multi-layered. The experiments demonstrated premeditation and systematic planning. They showed researchers pursuing academic goals with complete disregard for human suffering. They revealed administrative coordination at the highest levels of government. It produced detailed documentation that made denial impossible. And most fundamentally, they showed what medicine becomes when consent disappears, when prisoners become specimens, when reproductive capacity becomes a target for elimination. The tribunal didn't just punish individual crimes. It established a framework declaring that certain lines can never be crossed, that certain rights are absolute, that medicine without consent isn't medicine at all. And that framework, forged in a courtroom in Nuremberg while judges reviewed evidence from Auschwitz, shapes every medical interaction, every research protocol, every patient's rights form you encounter today. So here's what I want you to think about. 2 questions for the comments. First, where's the line between legitimate medical research that pushes boundaries and exploitation of human subjects? Is consent always sufficient? Can someone truly consent when they're desperate for treatment or compensation? When does institutional review become insufficient protection? Second, was execution appropriate for coordinators and administrators like Victor Brack, who didn't personally conduct experiments but facilitated them through bureaucratic channels? Does administrative guilt merit the same penalty as hands-on participation? Or does creating infrastructure for atrocity represent an even greater crime because it enables systematic rather than individual harm? These aren't simple questions. They don't have obvious answers. But they're questions we need to keep asking because the principles established at Nuremberg only work if we continue applying them, questioning them, and defending them against erosion. The women of Block 10 deserve justice. The 7 men hanged at Landsberg received it. And the ethical framework established through that trial continues protecting people today from medicine that forgets its fundamental obligation. First, do no harm. And always, always obtain consent. If this deep dive into the doctor's trial and the establishment of modern medical ethics was valuable, make sure you're subscribed for more historical analysis using primary sources and trial transcripts. Hit that like button so the algorithm knows this content matters. And seriously, drop your thoughts in the comments on those 2 questions. I read everything, and I'm genuinely interested in how you think about the boundaries between research and exploitation, about administrative guilt, and about how we preserve the principles established in 1947 in a world that constantly tests them. The line drawn at Nuremberg still matters. Make sure we never forget why it exists.